A black woman named Melanie is unfairly arrested for robbery, but the officers didn't know who her husband was. As the truth unravels, a confrontation is set in motion that changes everything. What shocking secrets will come to light, and how far will they go to set things right? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Melanie Carter woke up with a smile on her face. Today was a special day. The sun peeked through the curtains, casting a warm glow on her bedroom. She stretched and turned to look at her husband, Marcus, still peacefully asleep beside her. "Happy birthday, my love," she whispered, planting a soft kiss on his cheek. Marcus stirred slightly but didn't wake up. Melanie's heart swelled with love as she gazed at him. After 10 years of marriage, she still felt like the luckiest woman in the world. Quietly, she slipped out of bed and headed to the kitchen. As she brewed coffee, Melanie's mind raced with excitement. Today was the day she would find the perfect gift for Marcus. "What do you get for the man who has everything?" she mused, sipping her coffee. Marcus wasn't just her husband. He was her rock, her biggest supporter. As a renowned public attorney, he dedicated his life to defending the rights of the poor. His passion for justice inspired Melanie every day. She glanced at the clock. It was time to get ready for work. As a successful entrepreneur, Melanie had built her own company from the ground up. But today, her mind was far from business matters. "I'll take a long lunch break," she decided. "That'll give me time to shop." As she got dressed, Melanie's thoughts drifted to the first gift Marcus had ever given her, a simple silver bracelet. She touched the delicate chain on her wrist, smiling at the memory. "I want to make him feel as special as he made me feel that day," she said to herself. Melanie grabbed her purse and keys, then paused at the bedroom door. Marcus was still sound asleep, his face peaceful. She felt a rush of love and gratitude. "I'll make this birthday one you'll never forget," she promised softly. With a spring in her step, Melanie left for work, her heart full of love and her mind buzzing with gift ideas. This was going to be a wonderful day. Melanie stepped into the gleaming interior of Elite Treasures luxury goods, her eyes widening at the dazzling array of high-end items on display. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow over glass cases filled with sparkling jewelry and exquisite watches. The plush carpet muffled her footsteps as she moved through the store, her fingers trailing lightly over leather handbags and silk scarves. "This is perfect," she murmured to herself, imagining Marcus's face lighting up at any of these beautiful gifts. As Melanie browsed, Mr. Griffin emerged from his office at the back of the store. His eyes immediately locked onto the unfamiliar woman, examining an expensive watch display. A frown creased his forehead as he watched her closely. "She looks just like..." Mr. Griffin's thoughts trailed off as he recalled the security footage from last week's robbery. The suspect had been a woman with similar features to this customer. Same height, same hair color. His heart began to race. Could this be the same person? Mr. Griffin's palms grew sweaty as he gripped the edge of the counter. He'd worked hard to build this business, inheriting it from his father and vowing to protect it at all costs. Melanie, oblivious to Mr. Griffin's scrutiny, picked up a sleek silver watch. She turned it over in her hands, admiring its craftsmanship. "Marcus would love this," she said softly, a smile playing on her lips. Mr. Griffin's suspicion grew with each passing moment. He watched as Melanie moved from display to display, touching various items. In his mind, her innocent browsing began to look more like casing the store for another potential theft. "I can't let it happen again," Mr. Griffin muttered under his breath. His judgment clouded by fear and prejudice, he failed to see the genuine joy and excitement on Melanie's face as she shopped for her husband's gift. Instead, all Mr. Griffin could focus on were his own biased assumptions. His fingers inched towards the silent alarm button under the counter, ready to call for security at a moment's notice. Melanie pointed the silver watch from its velvet cushion, her heart fluttering with excitement. This was it, the perfect gift for Marcus. She imagined his eyes lighting up when he opened the box, picturing the way the sleek timepiece would look on his wrist. "Excuse me?" she called softly to a nearby salesperson. "I'd like to take a closer look at this one, please." As the salesperson approached with a polite smile, Mr. Griffin tensed behind the counter. His eyes darted between Melanie and the two security guards stationed near the entrance. With a discreet wave, he beckoned them over. The guards, both tall men in crisp black suits, moved quietly across the store. Mr. Griffin leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "Keep an eye on that woman by the watch display," he muttered, nodding towards Melanie. "She matches the description of our robbery suspect from last week." The guards exchanged glances before one of them spoke. "Are you sure, sir? She seems to be shopping normally." Mr. Griffin's jaw clenched. "I'm not taking any chances. Just watch her closely." Unaware of the growing tension around her, Melanie continued to admire the watch. The salesperson had brought over a magnifying glass, allowing her to examine the intricate details of the dial. "It's beautiful," Melanie breathed, her fingers tracing the smooth metal band. "My husband will love it." As she spoke, one of the security guards positioned himself near the watch display, pretending to study a nearby collection of cufflinks. His eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses, never left Melanie. Mr. Griffin wrung his hands behind the counter, his suspicion growing with each passing moment. He watched as Melanie asked to try on a different watch, then another. To him, her careful consideration looked more and more like an attempt to case the store. The tension in the air thickened, though Melanie remained blissfully unaware. She was lost in thoughts of Marcus, his dedication to his work, his unwavering support for her, and the love that had only grown stronger over the years. This gift was a small token of her appreciation for all that he did. As Melanie finally decided on the perfect watch, she turned to the salesperson with a bright smile. "I'll take this one, please." The security guards tensed, ready to act at a moment's notice. Mr. Griffin's hand hovered near the silent alarm, his heart pounding in his chest. Melanie approached the counter, her heart light with the joy of finding the perfect gift for Marcus. The watch felt heavy in her hand, a symbol of her love and appreciation for her husband. As she neared, she noticed Mr. Griffin's tense posture and furrowed brow, but she brushed it off as the stress of running a busy store. By then, two security guards suddenly appeared on either side of Melanie. Their imposing presence cast a shadow over her, and she felt a flicker of unease. "Ma'am, we need you to hand over that watch," one of the guards said, his voice gruff and authoritative. Melanie blinked in confusion, her smile faltering. "I'm sorry, is there a problem?" Mr. Griffin stepped forward, his face stern. "We have reason to believe you're attempting to steal that watch. Please hand it over immediately." The accusation hit Melanie like a punch to the gut. She gasped, her eyes widening in shock. "Steal? I don't understand. I was just asking about the price. I want to buy it for my husband." The second guard reached for Melanie's wrist. "Ma'am, please cooperate. We don't want any trouble." Melanie instinctively pulled back, clutching the watch to her chest. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm not a thief. I'm a customer. Please, let me explain." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The guards closed in, their faces set in grim determination. Mr. Griffin watched from behind the counter, his suspicion hardening into certainty. "I'm going to have to ask you to come with us," the first guard said, reaching for Melanie's arm. Tears welled up in Melanie's eyes as the reality of the situation sank in. She looked around the store, hoping to find a friendly face, someone who could vouch for her innocence. But all she saw were averted gazes and suspicious glances. "Please," Melanie whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "This is all a misunderstanding. I just wanted to buy a gift for my husband." The security guards tightened their grip on Melanie's arms, causing her to wince. She felt her heart pounding in her chest as they began to lead her away from the counter. Other customers in the store stopped what they were doing, turning to watch the scene unfold with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Please, you're making a terrible mistake," Melanie pleaded, her voice cracking with emotion. "I'm not a thief. I'm a business owner myself. I came here to buy a gift for my husband." But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The guards continued to escort her towards the back of the store, their faces set in stone. Melanie's eyes darted around, searching for anyone who might help her. "Can anyone hear me?" she called out, her voice rising in desperation. "This isn't right. I haven't done anything wrong." A few customers shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves, but no one stepped forward to intervene. Melanie felt a wave of helplessness wash over her as she realized how alone she was in this moment. Mr. Griffin emerged from behind the counter, his face a mask of determination. He approached Melanie and the guards, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "I'm calling the police," he announced, pulling out his cell phone. "We've had a string of robberies lately, and I'm not taking any chances." Melanie's eyes widened in disbelief. "The police? But I haven't stolen anything. Please, just check the security cameras. You'll see I'm telling the truth." Mr. Griffin ignored her pleas, turning away as he dialed the number. Melanie could hear him speaking in low, urgent tones, describing her as a suspect in a robbery. Tears began to stream down Melanie's face as the reality of the situation hit her. She thought of Marcus, waiting at home, unaware of the nightmare unfolding. How could a day that started with so much joy and love turn into this? "You're making a huge mistake," Melanie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm innocent. Please just listen to me." But as the guards led her to a small office in the back of the store, Melanie realized that her words were falling on deaf ears. She could only hope that when the police arrived, they would see reason and understand the terrible misunderstanding that had occurred. The shrill sound of police sirens filled the air as 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of the luxury store. Melanie's heart sank as she watched through the store window, her hands trembling with fear and frustration. 2 officers entered the store, their faces stern and professional. Mr. Griffin rushed to meet them, gesturing wildly as he recounted his version of events. Melanie couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see the officers nodding gravely. As the police approached the office, Melanie straightened her back, trying to compose herself. She wiped away her tears, determined to explain the misunderstanding calmly and rationally. "Officers, please," she began as they entered the room. "There's been a terrible mistake. I'm not—" But before she could finish, one of the officers cut her off. "Ma'am, please turn around and put your hands behind your back." Melanie's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? No, you don't understand. I'm innocent. I was just trying to buy a gift for my husband." The officers exchanged a quick glance before one of them stepped forward, gently but firmly taking hold of Melanie's arm. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we're going to have to take you in for questioning. You have the right to remain silent." Melanie felt the cold metal of handcuffs encircle her wrists. The reality of the situation hit her like a punch to the gut. This was really happening. Tears welled up in her eyes once more as the officers led her out of the office and through the store. Customers and staff alike stared openly, some whispering behind their hands. Melanie had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. "Please," she pleaded one last time, her voice breaking. "I'm telling the truth. I didn't steal anything. This is all a misunderstanding." But her words seemed to evaporate in the air, unheard and unacknowledged. As they approached the store's entrance, Melanie could see a small crowd had gathered outside, drawn by the commotion. The bright sunlight hit her face as she was led out of the store, momentarily blinding her. She blinked rapidly, trying to adjust, only to realize that several people had their phones out, recording the scene. Melanie's cheeks burned with shame and humiliation. She lowered her head, unable to bear the weight of all those eyes upon her. As the officers guided her towards the waiting patrol car, she felt utterly helpless and alone. The police cruiser pulled up to the station, its lights still flashing. Melanie sat in the back, her heart pounding as the reality of her situation sank in. She'd never been in trouble with the law before, and now she was being treated like a common criminal. As the officers led her inside, Melanie tried to keep her head high, but the stares from other officers and staff made her want to shrink into herself. They walked her through a series of cold, gray hallways until they reached the processing area. "Name?" a bored-looking officer behind a desk asked. "Melanie Carter," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer typed something into his computer. "Date of birth?" Melanie answered each question mechanically, feeling more and more like a number rather than a person. They took her fingerprints, snapped her mugshot, and confiscated her personal belongings. With each step of the process, she felt a piece of her dignity slip away. Finally, an officer led her to a holding cell. The metal door clanged shut behind her, the sound echoing in her ears like a death knell. Melanie looked around the small, bare room. A hard bench lined one wall, and a stainless steel toilet sat in the corner. The smell of disinfectant couldn't quite mask the underlying odor of despair. Melanie sank onto the bench, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to fend off the chill that seemed to seep from the concrete walls. Tears welled up in her eyes, and this time she didn't try to hold them back. How had this happened? Just a few hours ago, she'd been excited about buying Marcus a special gift. Now, she was locked in a cell, accused of a crime she didn't commit. The injustice of it all made her chest ache. Fear gripped her heart as she thought about what might come next. Would anyone believe her? What if she couldn't prove her innocence? The thought of going to prison for something she didn't do was almost too much to bear. Melanie closed her eyes, wishing she could wake up from this nightmare. But when she opened them again, she was still in the cold, lonely cell. She had never felt so isolated, so utterly alone. At the same time, across town in a bustling law office, Marcus Carter sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of papers and legal documents. His brow furrowed in concentration as he prepared for an important case. This was a big one, a chance to help a group of low-income families fight against an unjust eviction. Marcus lived for moments like these, where he could use his skills to make a real difference. Just as he was jotting down some key points for his opening statement, his cell phone rang. The name on the screen was Lisa, one of Melanie's close friends. Thinking it might be about the surprise party they were planning for Melanie's birthday next month, Marcus answered with a smile. "Hey Lisa, what's up?" But the frantic voice on the other end wiped the smile from his face in an instant. "Marcus, oh my God, Marcus, it's Melanie, they arrested her." Lisa's words tumbled out in a panicked rush. Marcus felt his heart drop. "What? Slow down, Lisa. What do you mean, arrested?" As Lisa explained what she had witnessed at the store, Marcus's confusion turned to shock, then to anger. His free hand clenched into a fist, knuckles turning white. "They did what?" he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Are you absolutely sure?" Lisa's tearful confirmation was all he needed. Without hesitation, Marcus stood up, nearly knocking over his chair in the process. "I'm on my way to the station right now. Thank you for calling me, Lisa." He ended the call and grabbed his jacket, his mind racing. How could this happen? Melanie arrested? It was unthinkable. She was the kindest, most law-abiding person he knew. This had to be some horrible mistake. As he strode out of his office, his assistant looked up in surprise. "Cancel all my appointments for the rest of the day," Marcus barked, not breaking his stride. "Family emergency." He didn't wait for a response, his long legs carrying him swiftly to the elevator. As he jabbed the button for the parking garage, Marcus took a deep breath, trying to calm the fury building inside him. He needed to keep a clear head if he was going to help Melanie. The elevator seemed to crawl downward, each second feeling like an eternity. Marcus's mind whirled with questions and concerns. Was Melanie okay? How could the store owner and the police make such a terrible mistake? And most importantly, how quickly could he get her out of there? Marcus burst through the doors of the police station, his eyes blazing with determination. The bustling noise of the precinct faded into the background as he strode purposefully to the front desk. "I'm here to see my wife, Melanie Carter," he demanded, his voice firm and controlled despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. The officer at the desk barely glanced up from his computer. "Visiting hours are over, sir. You'll have to come back tomorrow." Marcus leaned in, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "You don't understand. My wife was wrongfully arrested today. I need to see her now." The officer sighed, clearly annoyed. "Look, buddy, I don't make the rules. Come back." "My name is Marcus Carter," Marcus interrupted, his voice low but intense. "I'm a public attorney, and I'm here to represent my wife." At the mention of his name, the officer's eyes widened in recognition. Marcus Carter was well known in legal circles, respected for his work defending the underprivileged. The atmosphere in the station shifted palpably. "Mr. Carter, I'm sorry, I didn't realize," the officer stammered. "Let me get the sergeant." As the officer hurried away, Marcus took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He needed to stay composed for Melanie's sake. A few minutes later, he was led to a small, stark room. When Melanie was brought in, Marcus's heart clenched at the sight of her tear-stained face and disheveled appearance. "Marcus!" Melanie cried, rushing into his arms. He held her tightly, feeling her body shake with sobs. "It's okay, sweetheart. I'm here now," he murmured, stroking her hair. Melanie pulled back, her eyes filled with fear and confusion. "Marcus, I didn't do anything wrong. I was just shopping and suddenly they were accusing me of stealing. How could this happen?" Marcus cupped her face gently, his eyes locked on hers. "Listen to me, Melanie. I promise you, I will do everything in my power to clear your name and make this right. We're going to fight this together, okay?" Marcus set to work immediately, his legal mind kicking into high gear. He knew time was of the essence, and every moment Melanie spent in that cell was an injustice he couldn't bear. First, he reached out to the friend who had witnessed Melanie's arrest. "Tell me everything you saw," Marcus urged, his pen poised over a notepad. As the friend recounted the events, Marcus's frown deepened. The pieces weren't adding up. Next, he headed to the luxury store. The afternoon sun beat down on him as he pushed through the revolving door, determination etched on his face. Inside, he approached a nervous-looking sales clerk. "I need to speak with Mr. Griffin," Marcus said firmly. Mr. Griffin emerged from his office, his face pale. "Mr. Carter, I presume," he said, his voice shaky. "That's right," Marcus replied. "I'm here about my wife, Melanie Carter. I need to see your surveillance footage from today." Mr. Griffin hesitated, but Marcus's unwavering gaze left no room for argument. They retreated to a small security room, where Marcus carefully reviewed the day's recordings. As he watched, his heart raced. There, clear as day, was Melanie browsing the store, her actions innocent and unsuspicious. But more importantly, he noticed something else. A woman who bore a striking resemblance to Melanie, lurking in the background. "There," Marcus pointed. "That's your real suspect." Mr. Griffin's face paled even further. "Oh no," he whispered. "What have I done?" Marcus's jaw clenched. "You made a terrible mistake, Mr. Griffin. One that's caused my wife immense pain and humiliation." Leaving the store with a copy of the footage, Marcus's next stop was the police station. He marched in, evidence in hand, ready to confront the officers who had so hastily arrested Melanie. "I have proof of my wife's innocence," he announced to the startled desk sergeant, "and I demand her immediate release." Marcus strode into the police station, his eyes blazing with determination. He clutched the evidence tightly in his hand, ready to right the wrong that had been done to his beloved Melanie. "I need to speak with the officers in charge of Melanie Carter's case," he demanded, his voice firm and unwavering. The desk sergeant, recognizing Marcus, quickly ushered him into a small conference room. Two officers entered, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Gentlemen," Marcus began, his tone measured but intense, "I have evidence that proves my wife's innocence." He spread out the documents and photos on the table, pointing to the surveillance footage. "This clearly shows that Melanie was not the person you were looking for. There was another woman in the store who matches the description of your suspect." The officers leaned in, their brows furrowing as they examined the evidence. Marcus continued, his voice growing more passionate with each word. "Furthermore, the arrest was conducted without proper procedure. You failed to read Melanie her rights, and you didn't even bother to verify her identity or alibi before bringing her in." One of the officers, a younger man with a troubled expression, spoke up. "Mr. Carter, we were acting on information provided by the store owner." Marcus cut him off. "That's no excuse for neglecting proper police work. You relied solely on one man's biased assumption and didn't bother to investigate further." The older officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We understand your frustration, Mr. Carter, but—" "No," Marcus interrupted, his voice rising. "You don't understand. My wife, an innocent woman, has been sitting in a cell for hours because of your negligence. This is a clear case of racial profiling and a violation of her civil rights." The officers exchanged worried glances. They knew Marcus was right, but the implications of their mistake were daunting. Admitting to such a grave error could have serious consequences for their careers and the department's reputation. We'll need to review this evidence and consult with our superiors," the older officer said hesitantly. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes locked on theirs. "Every minute you delay is another injustice against my wife. I demand her immediate release and a full apology from this department." The officers fidgeted, clearly torn between their desire to correct their mistake and their fear of the repercussions. The tension in the room was palpable as they grappled with the weight of their decision. Marcus left the police station, his jaw set with determination. He knew he needed to do more than just argue with the officers. It was time to bring in the big guns. As he drove, Marcus called his legal team on speakerphone. "I need everyone at the office in an hour," he said firmly. "We've got a fight on our hands." Back at his law firm, Marcus paced the conference room as his team filed in. The air crackled with tension and purpose. "Listen up," Marcus began, his voice strong and clear. "My wife, Melanie, has been wrongfully arrested. We're not just getting her out. We're holding everyone involved accountable." He laid out the details of the case, his words painting a vivid picture of injustice. His team listened intently, their faces growing more serious with each passing moment. "Jim, I need you to draft a civil rights lawsuit against the police department," Marcus instructed. "Sarah, start preparing a case against the store for racial profiling and false accusation." As his team sprang into action, Marcus picked up his phone again. He scrolled through his contacts, calling influential friends in the community, civil rights leaders, local politicians, and respected business owners. "We need to make some noise," he told each of them. "This isn't just about Melanie. It's about every person of color who's been unfairly targeted and accused." Within hours, Marcus had mobilized a small army of supporters. Social media was buzzing with the story, and local news stations were picking up on the developing situation. Marcus stood at the window of his office, looking out at the city. His mind raced with legal strategies and next steps. He thought of Melanie, alone in that cell, and his heart ached. But he knew that his actions now would not only free her but could potentially change the system for the better. "I'm coming for you, honey," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And we're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else again." Meanwhile, in the stark confines of the holding cell, Melanie sat on the hard bench, her shoulders slumped. The events of the day played over and over in her mind like a terrible movie she couldn't turn off. She remembered the cold touch of the handcuffs, the shocked faces of other shoppers, and the smug look on Mr. Griffin's face as she was led away. The memory made her stomach churn. "How could this happen?" she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the quiet cell. Anger bubbled up inside her, hot and fierce. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, locked up like a criminal. The injustice of it all made her want to scream. But as quickly as the anger came, it was replaced by a wave of despair. What would this mean for her life, for Marcus's career? They had worked so hard to build their reputations, to make a difference in their community. Now, in the blink of an eye, it all felt like it was crumbling around her. Melanie's eyes stung with unshed tears. She blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. As she sat there, surrounded by cold concrete walls, Melanie's thoughts turned to Marcus. She knew he must be worried sick. She imagined him working tirelessly to free her, his determination a beacon of hope in this dark moment. The thought of Marcus sparked something in Melanie. A small flame of resolve began to grow in her chest. She might be locked up for now, but she wasn't beaten. Not by a long shot. "This isn't right," she said softly, her voice growing stronger with each word. "And I'm not going to let them get away with it." Melanie straightened her back, lifting her chin. She may have been wrongfully accused and humiliated, but she was still Melanie Carter. She was strong, she was resilient, and she was innocent. As the hours ticked by, Melanie's resolve only grew stronger. She knew that when she got out of here, she wouldn't just let this go. She would fight, not just for herself, but for anyone else who might face this kind of injustice. Marcus strode into the police station, his face set with determination. He carried a thick folder of evidence under his arm, ready to fight for Melanie's freedom. The receptionist recognized him immediately and called the police chief. "Mr. Carter," the police chief said, emerging from his office, "I understand you're here about your wife's case." Marcus nodded curtly. "We need to talk, now." In the chief's office, Marcus wasted no time. He spread out the documents on the desk, his voice steady but filled with barely contained anger. "Chief, I have irrefutable evidence that my wife is innocent," Marcus began. "Here's the surveillance footage from the store. It clearly shows Melanie simply shopping, not stealing anything." The police chief leaned forward, his brow furrowed as he examined the images. Marcus continued, his voice growing more intense. "And here are statements from witnesses who saw the whole thing. They all say the same thing. Melanie did nothing wrong." The chief's face grew more troubled with each piece of evidence. But Marcus wasn't done. "What happened to my wife wasn't just a mistake," he said, his eyes locked on the chief's. "It was racial profiling, plain and simple. Mr. Griffin saw a black woman in his store and immediately assumed she was a criminal. And your officers? They didn't even bother to check the facts before arresting her." The police chief shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He could see the storm brewing, the potential scandal that could rock the department. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice cautious, "these are serious allegations." "They're not allegations, Chief," Marcus shot back. "They're facts, and I'm prepared to take this all the way if I have to. But right now, what I want is for my wife to be released. Immediately." The chief was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from the evidence to Marcus's determined face. Finally, he sighed heavily. "All right, Mr. Carter," he said. "I'll review the case right away. If everything checks out, we'll release your wife as soon as possible." Marcus nodded, feeling a small sense of relief. But he knew this was just the beginning. "Thank you, Chief. But know this. We're not going to let this go. What happened to Melanie shouldn't happen to anyone else." The chief nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the situation. He picked up his phone, ready to start the process of reviewing Melanie's case. The police chief sat at his desk, his face etched with concern. He picked up the phone and dialed Mr. Griffin's number. After a few rings, the store owner answered. "Mr. Griffin, this is Police Chief Johnson. We need to discuss the incident with Mrs. Carter at your store." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Chief, I was just protecting my business," Mr. Griffin said, his voice defensive. "That woman matched the description of a recent shoplifter." The chief sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Mr. Griffin, we have new evidence that suggests Mrs. Carter is innocent. In fact, it appears there was no basis for suspicion at all." "But I saw her acting suspiciously," Mr. Griffin protested. "She was looking at expensive items and shopping, Mr. Griffin," the chief interrupted. "That's all she was doing. Shopping." The chief could hear Mr. Griffin's heavy breathing on the other end of the line. He continued, his voice firm but calm. "We have surveillance footage that shows Mrs. Carter did nothing wrong, and multiple witness statements confirm this." There was a long silence. When Mr. Griffin spoke again, his voice was quieter. I was so sure." "Mr. Griffin, I need to be clear here," the chief said. "What happened could be seen as racial profiling. There could be serious legal consequences." The store owner's voice trembled slightly. "Legal consequences? But I was just trying to protect my store." "I understand that," the chief replied, "but your actions and ours have caused significant harm to an innocent woman. Mrs. Carter's husband is a prominent attorney, and he's not going to let this go." Mr. Griffin was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the defensiveness had left his voice. I never meant for this to happen. I just thought, I was so sure she was the thief." The chief could hear the doubt creeping into Mr. Griffin's voice. We all made mistakes here, Mr. Griffin, but now we need to make it right. Mr. Griffin sat in the dimly lit security room of his store, his eyes fixed on the small monitor before him. The surveillance footage played, showing Melanie Carter's every move from the moment she entered the store. As he watched, a knot formed in his stomach, growing tighter with each passing second. On the screen, Melanie browsed the displays, her face lit up with excitement as she examined various items. She smiled at other customers, chatted politely with staff, and carefully inspected the watch she had chosen. There was no hint of suspicious behavior, no sign of the thief Mr. Griffin had been so certain she was. "Oh no," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What have I done?" The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His hands trembled as he rewound the footage, watching it again and again. Each viewing only confirmed his horrible mistake. Mr. Griffin slumped back in his chair, his face pale and drawn. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He had been so sure, so convinced that Melanie was a threat. But now, seeing the truth laid bare before him, he couldn't deny the ugly reality of his own prejudice. "I judged her because of how she looked," he admitted to himself, shame coloring his words. "I saw her skin color and jumped to conclusions. How could I have been so wrong?" Guilt washed over him in waves. He thought of Melanie's face as she was led away in handcuffs, the hurt and confusion in her eyes. He had caused that pain, had robbed an innocent woman of her dignity and freedom. Mr. Griffin stood up abruptly, pacing the small room. His mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. He knew he needed to make things right, but the task seemed overwhelming. How could he possibly make up for such a grievous error? "I need to apologize," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "But will that be enough? Will she even want to hear from me?" The thought of facing Melanie and her husband filled him with dread, but he knew it was necessary. He had to own up to his mistake, to take responsibility for the harm he had caused. But the path forward was unclear, and Mr. Griffin felt lost in a sea of regret and uncertainty. Marcus paced back and forth in his office, his jaw clenched with determination. He had spent hours preparing a public statement that would expose the injustice done to Melanie and shine a light on the broader issue of racial profiling. The words on his computer screen burned with righteous anger and a call for change. "This ends now," he muttered, his voice low but filled with resolve. "Mr. Griffin, this is Marcus Carter. I hope you've had a chance to review that surveillance footage," Marcus said, his words clipped and precise. "Because I'm holding a press conference to discuss how your biased assumptions led to my wife's wrongful arrest." Mr. Griffin stammered on the other end of the line. "Mr. Carter, I'm so sorry. I made a terrible mistake. Please, give me a chance to make this right." Marcus took a deep breath, trying to calm the anger that threatened to overwhelm him. "Then do it now. Call the police. Tell them you were wrong, and be prepared to face the consequences of your actions." As he hung up, Marcus felt the weight of what he was about to do. He was not just fighting for Melanie anymore. He was taking a stand against a systemic issue that had affected countless others. The thought both energized and sobered him. The police chief sat behind his desk, his face etched with worry. He rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The threat of Marcus Carter's press conference loomed large, promising a public relations nightmare for the department. With a heavy sigh, he picked up the phone and dialed Marcus's number. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice strained. "I've reviewed the evidence. We're dropping all charges against your wife. She'll be released immediately." Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was quickly replaced by a steely determination. "Thank you, Chief," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "But this isn't over. We need to talk about making real changes." Within the hour, Melanie was free. She rushed into Marcus's arms, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered, burying her face in his chest. Marcus held her tight, his heart aching for what she had been through. "You're safe now," he murmured, stroking her hair. But even as he comforted his wife, his mind was racing with thoughts of what needed to be done next. Later that evening, as Melanie rested at home, Marcus sat in their living room, his laptop open before him. He was drafting a list of demands for the police department and the store. It wasn't enough that Melanie was free. He wanted to ensure that no one else would suffer the same injustice. "We need better training for officers," he muttered to himself as he typed, "and stricter accountability measures. And as for that store..." He paused, thinking of Mr. Griffin's stammered apology. It wasn't enough. There needed to be consequences, but also education. He added another point to his list: mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all store employees. Marcus looked up as Melanie entered the room, wrapped in a soft robe. She sat beside him, peering at the screen. "What are you working on?" she asked softly. He took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm making sure what happened to you never happens to anyone else," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We're going to make them change, Melanie. We're going to make things better." Melanie nodded, her eyes shining with a mixture of love and resolve. "We'll do it together," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. Marcus smiled, drawing strength from her presence. He knew the fight ahead would be challenging, but with Melanie by his side, he felt ready to take on the world. This was just the beginning of their journey towards justice and change. The next morning, the steps of City Hall were crowded with reporters and cameras. Marcus and Melanie Carter stood side by side at a podium, their faces serious but determined. Marcus cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice strong and clear. "Yesterday, my wife Melanie was wrongfully arrested while shopping for my birthday gift," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "She was accused of a crime she didn't commit, simply because of the color of her skin." Melanie squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his presence. Marcus continued, "This isn't just about us. It's about every person who has ever been judged unfairly, who has ever felt the sting of prejudice." He held up a folder filled with documents. "I have here evidence that proves beyond a doubt that my wife is innocent. Surveillance footage, witness statements, and records of improper police procedures." The crowd murmured as Marcus detailed the evidence, explaining how racial profiling had led to Melanie's arrest. Cameras flashed and reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. "We're calling for immediate action," Marcus declared. "The police department must implement better training and stricter accountability measures. And the store where this incident occurred must face consequences and provide diversity training for all employees." Melanie stepped forward, her voice shaking slightly but growing stronger as she spoke. "What happened to me was terrifying and humiliating," she said. "But I'm standing here today because I want to make sure it never happens to anyone else." As they finished speaking, a wave of applause swept through the crowd. Reporters called out questions, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of sound. Marcus and Melanie stood firm, answering each query with honesty and conviction. The press conference was broadcast live on local news channels, and within hours, social media was buzzing with support for the Carters. Hashtags like #Justice for Melanie and #End Racial Profiling began trending as people shared their own stories of discrimination. In the days following the press conference, the Carters' story spread like wildfire throughout the community. People from all walks of life began to discuss the issues of racial profiling and the need for accountability in law enforcement and businesses. Melanie and Marcus's phones buzzed constantly with messages of support. Emails flooded their inboxes, and their social media accounts were overwhelmed with comments from well-wishers and supporters. "I can't believe how many people are reaching out," Melanie said to Marcus one evening, scrolling through her phone. Her eyes were wide with amazement. Marcus nodded, his expression a mix of gratitude and determination. "It's not just about us anymore. People are sharing their own stories. They're speaking up." The community rallied behind the Carters in ways they never expected. Local organizations held town hall meetings to discuss racial bias and how to combat it. Churches and community centers organized workshops on recognizing and addressing prejudice. One afternoon, Melanie received a call from a local youth group. "Mrs. Carter," the young leader said, her voice filled with enthusiasm, "we're organizing a peaceful march this weekend. Would you and Mr. Carter consider speaking at it? Melanie felt a lump in her throat. We'd be honored, she replied, her voice thick with emotion. The march drew hundreds of people, all carrying signs with messages of unity and justice. As Melanie and Marcus stood before the crowd, they saw faces of all colors looking back at them with hope and determination. This is what change looks like, Marcus said to the crowd, his voice carrying over the hushed gathering. It starts with each one of us standing up for what's right. The push for change gained momentum. Petitions circulated calling for better police training and stricter accountability measures. Local businesses began reviewing their policies and implementing diversity training programs. Melanie and Marcus exchanged a look, both feeling a mix of emotions. It was a small step, but an important one. As the days passed, the Carters found themselves at the center of a growing movement for change. They were exhausted, but hopeful, knowing that their painful experience was leading to something positive. Mr. Griffin paced nervously in his office, his hands shaking as he dialed Melanie's number. The weight of his actions pressed heavily on his conscience, and he knew he had to make things right. When Melanie answered, Mr. Griffin's voice quivered. Mrs. Carter, this is Mr. Griffin from the store. I was hoping we could meet. I need to apologize to you in person. There was a long pause on the other end. Melanie's voice was cautious when she finally spoke. Mr. Griffin, I appreciate you reaching out. I'll meet with you, but I'd like my husband to be present. They agreed to meet at a small coffee shop the next day. Mr. Griffin arrived early, his stomach in knots. When Melanie and Marcus walked in, he stood up quickly, nearly knocking over his chair. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Carter, thank you for coming, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Melanie nodded, her face a mask of composure. Marcus placed a protective hand on her shoulder as they sat down. Mr. Griffin took a deep breath. Mrs. Carter, I can't begin to express how sorry I am for what happened. My actions were inexcusable. I let my prejudices and fears cloud my judgment, and I caused you immense pain and humiliation. Tears welled up in his eyes as he continued. I've been doing a lot of soul-searching since that day. I realize now how deeply ingrained my biases were and how much harm they caused. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it, but I want you to know that I'm committed to changing, to doing better. Melanie listened silently, her eyes never leaving Mr. Griffin's face. She could see the genuine remorse in his eyes, the way his hands trembled as he spoke. Mr. Griffin, she said softly, what you did hurt me deeply. It shook my faith in people and made me feel less than human. But I can see that you're truly sorry. She paused, taking a moment to gather her thoughts. I appreciate you taking responsibility for your actions. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong and to commit to change. Mr. Griffin's eyes brimmed with tears as he continued, his voice thick with emotion. Mrs. Carter, I know my actions caused you pain and suffering. I let my fears and prejudices control me, and I failed you as a fellow human being. I'm truly, deeply sorry. Melanie sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She could feel the sincerity in Mr. Griffin's words, but the memory of that humiliating day still stung. I've been thinking about what I did every day since it happened, Mr. Griffin went on. I realize now how wrong I was, how my biases hurt innocent people. I'm committed to changing, to learning, to doing better. As he spoke, Melanie felt a mix of emotions washing over her. There was still anger and hurt, but also a growing sense of understanding. She saw the genuine remorse in Mr. Griffin's eyes, the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of his guilt. Marcus squeezed Melanie's hand gently, offering silent support. She took a deep breath, considering her response carefully. Mr. Griffin, Melanie began, her voice steady. What happened? It made me feel small, insignificant, and judged for something I am, not something I did. Mr. Griffin nodded, his eyes downcast. But, Melanie continued, I can see that you're truly sorry, and I understand that holding on to this anger and pain will only hurt me more in the long run. She paused, taking another deep breath. I choose to forgive you, Mr. Griffin. Not because what you did was okay, but because I believe in second chances and the power of change. Mr. Griffin looked up, surprise and gratitude etched on his face. Thank you, Mrs. Carter. Your forgiveness means more than I can express. I promise I'll work hard to earn it every day. Meanwhile, at the police station, a tense atmosphere hung in the air. The officers involved in Melanie's arrest sat nervously in the conference room, waiting for their superiors to arrive. They exchanged worried glances, knowing that their actions had caused a significant uproar in the community. The police chief entered the room, his face stern and serious. He took his seat at the head of the table and cleared his throat. Gentlemen, we're here to discuss the recent incident involving Mrs. Melanie Carter. The officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the chief continued. Your actions that day were not only a violation of our department's policies, but also a breach of the trust our community places in us. He paused, letting his words sink in. After careful consideration and review of the evidence, we've come to a decision regarding disciplinary action. The room fell silent as the officers braced themselves for the consequences. Effective immediately, you will all be placed on unpaid leave for a period of 3 months, the chief announced. During this time, you will be required to attend comprehensive training on bias, discrimination, and proper police procedures. The officers exchanged looks of shock and dismay. One of them opened his mouth to protest, but the chief held up his hand, silencing him. Additionally, the chief continued, as part of your rehabilitation, you will be required to offer your services to a community program that supports marginalized groups. This will give you the opportunity to understand the impact of your actions and to rebuild trust with the community you've sworn to protect and serve. The officers sat in stunned silence, the weight of their actions finally sinking in. They realized that their biases and hasty judgments had not only hurt an innocent woman, but had also damaged the reputation of the entire police force. I hope that this experience will serve as a wake-up call, the chief said, his voice softening slightly. We have a responsibility to treat every member of our community with respect and fairness. I expect each of you to use this time to reflect on your actions and come back as better officers and better human beings. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow through the windows of their cozy living room, Melanie and Marcus Carter sat side by side on their comfortable sofa. Their hands were intertwined, a silent testament to the strength of their bond. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions and challenges, but now, in the quiet of their home, they finally had a moment to reflect. Melanie leaned her head on Marcus's shoulder, letting out a deep sigh. I can't believe everything that's happened, she said softly. It feels like a lifetime ago that I walked into that store, just wanting to buy you a birthday gift. Marcus squeezed her hand gently. I know, honey, it's been a tough journey, but look at how far we've come. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in their thoughts. Despite the pain and injustice they had faced, a sense of pride swelled in their hearts. They had stood strong, fought for what was right, and emerged even stronger. You know, Melanie said, lifting her head to look at Marcus, I'm so proud of how we handled everything. We didn't let anger consume us. We fought for justice, but we also showed forgiveness. Marcus nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. That's true. And look at the changes happening in our community now. People are talking about racial profiling, about accountability. It's not perfect, but it's a start. Melanie's eyes welled up with tears, but they were tears of hope and gratitude. We did that, Marcus. We turned something horrible into something positive. Marcus pulled her close, planting a soft kiss on her forehead. We did it together, Mel. And I have to say, going through this with you, it's made me love and admire you even more. If that's even possible. Melanie chuckled softly, wiping away a stray tear. I feel the same way. We're stronger now, aren't we? As individuals and as a couple. Absolutely, Marcus agreed. We faced this challenge head-on, and we came out the other side even more united. I'm so grateful to have you by my side, Mel. The luxury store's grand reopening was a sight to behold. Colorful banners hung from the storefront, proclaiming, "Welcome to all," in bold letters. Inside, the polished floors gleamed and the display cases sparkled. But there was something different in the air, a sense of renewed purpose and commitment. Mr. Griffin stood at the entrance, nervously adjusting his tie. He had spent the past few weeks in intensive training, learning about unconscious bias and the devastating effects of racial profiling. The experience had been eye-opening and humbling. As customers began to trickle in, Mr. Griffin greeted each one with a warm smile and a sincere welcome. His staff, also freshly trained, mirrored his actions, treating every visitor with equal respect and attention. Near the watch counter, a young sales associate named Sarah approached an elderly couple. "Can I help you find anything today?" she asked, her voice friendly and professional. The couple smiled, clearly appreciating her attentiveness. Across the store, Mr. Griffin noticed a group of teenagers enter. In the past, he might have viewed them with suspicion, but now he simply nodded politely and said, "Please let us know if you need any assistance." As the day progressed, the store buzzed with activity. Customers from all walks of life browsed the luxury items, and the staff moved about, offering help without prejudice or bias. At one point, Mr. Griffin overheard a conversation between two of his employees. They were discussing how to approach a customer who seemed unsure about making a purchase. "Remember," the senior associate said, "our job is to make everyone feel welcome and valued, regardless of whether they buy anything or not." Mr. Griffin felt a surge of pride. His team was embracing the new policies wholeheartedly. They were creating the inclusive and respectful environment he had envisioned during those long days of training and reflection. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow through the store windows, Mr. Griffin took a moment to observe his transformed business. The atmosphere was warm and inviting, filled with the chatter of satisfied customers and the gentle hum of a store running smoothly. As the sun rose on a crisp morning, Officers Johnson and Rodriguez prepared for their first day back on duty. The past few months had been a whirlwind of intense training, community service, and deep self-reflection. They stood outside the police station, their uniforms crisp and badges gleaming, but their demeanor was markedly different from before. Officer Johnson took a deep breath. "You ready for this, Rodriguez?" he asked, his voice tinged with a mix of nervousness and determination. Rodriguez nodded, her eyes reflecting a newfound sense of purpose. "More than ready, it's time we do this job the right way." Their first stop of the day was the Carter residence. As they approached the front door, both officers felt a weight on their shoulders, the weight of their past mistakes, and the responsibility to make things right. Melanie Carter opened the door, surprise evident on her face. Marcus stood behind her, his expression guarded but curious. Officer Johnson cleared his throat. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, we're here to apologize for our actions and to share with you the changes we've undergone." The Carters invited them in, and for the next hour, the officers spoke openly about their training experiences. They described workshops on unconscious bias, role-playing exercises that put them in the shoes of those they had wronged, and community outreach programs that opened their eyes to the diverse experiences within their city. "We've implemented new protocols," Officer Rodriguez explained. "Every arrest now requires thorough documentation of probable cause. We've also established a civilian review board to oversee our actions." Marcus leaned forward, his interest piqued. "And how has this changed your approach to your work?" Officer Johnson replied, his voice filled with conviction. "We're more aware now. We question our assumptions, look for evidence before jumping to conclusions. It's about serving the community, all of the community, not just enforcing the law blindly." Melanie, who had been quiet, finally spoke. "Your actions caused us a lot of pain," she said softly, "but I'm glad to see you're working to change." The officers nodded solemnly, acknowledging the hurt they had caused. "We know we can't undo what happened," Officer Rodriguez said, "but we're committed to being better, to ensuring no one else goes through what you did." As they prepared to leave, both officers formally asked for forgiveness. The Carters exchanged a look, years of experience and wisdom passing between them in that silent moment. In the weeks following their meeting with the officers, Marcus and Melanie Carter found themselves thrust into a new role as advocates for social justice. Their experience had opened their eyes to the pressing need for change, and they were determined to use their platform to make a difference. One sunny afternoon, Marcus stood at a podium in the city park, addressing a crowd of eager listeners. His voice rang out clear and strong. "Our story is just one of many. We must work together to ensure that no one faces discrimination or injustice in our community." Melanie stood by his side, her presence a testament to their united front. She stepped forward to share her own thoughts. "What happened to me could happen to anyone. It's up to all of us to speak up and stand for what's right." Their words resonated with the crowd, sparking discussions and inspiring action. After the event, people lined up to share their own stories and ask how they could help. The Carters didn't stop there. They participated in community forums, sitting around tables with local leaders, police officers, and citizens from all walks of life. These discussions were often challenging but always productive. "We need to listen to each other," Melanie would often say during these meetings. "Real change starts with understanding." Marcus nodded in agreement. "And it continues with action. We're here to work together to find solutions." Their advocacy extended beyond public speaking. They partnered with local organizations, lending their time and resources to programs that promoted equality and justice. One Saturday morning found them volunteering at a legal clinic, offering free advice to those who couldn't afford representation. As Marcus helped a young mother understand her rights, he felt a sense of purpose. This was why he became a lawyer in the first place, to help those who needed it most. Melanie, meanwhile, worked with a group of high school students, sharing her story and encouraging them to become active in their community. "You have the power to shape the future," she told them, her eyes bright with passion. As the seasons changed, so did the community. The efforts of Marcus and Melanie Carter had sparked a transformation that touched every corner of their city. On a crisp autumn evening, the local park was filled with the sounds of laughter and music as people gathered to celebrate the positive changes that had taken root. Colorful banners hung between trees proclaiming messages of unity and justice. Children ran around with balloons tied to their wrists, their faces painted with symbols of peace. The air was thick with the aroma of food from various cultures, representing the diversity of the community. Mayor Bennett stood on a makeshift stage, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Tonight, we celebrate not just the changes in our policies and practices, but the change in our hearts. We've learned to see each other with new eyes, to listen with open minds, and to stand together against injustice." The crowd cheered, and the mayor continued, "None of this would have been possible without the courage and determination of two extraordinary individuals. Please join me in honoring Marcus and Melanie Carter." As Marcus and Melanie made their way to the stage, the applause was deafening. People reached out to shake their hands, pat their backs, and offer words of gratitude. The couple, hand in hand, climbed the steps to stand beside the mayor. Melanie, her eyes glistening with emotion, spoke first. "We never set out to be heroes. We simply believed that change was possible and necessary. What you see here today is the result of an entire community coming together, choosing love over fear, understanding over prejudice." Marcus nodded, adding, "This celebration isn't about us. It's about all of you. It's about the officers who embraced change, the business owners who implemented new practices, and every citizen who chose to be part of the solution." The crowd erupted in cheers once more. As the Carters looked out over the sea of faces, young and old of every color and background, they saw a community united. The park was alive with a renewed sense of purpose and hope. As the celebration continued around them, Marcus and Melanie slipped away from the crowd, finding a quiet spot beneath an old oak tree. The soft glow of lanterns hung in its branches, casting a warm light over them as they sat on a wooden bench. Marcus took Melanie's hand in his, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Can you believe how far we've come?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. Melanie leaned her head on his shoulder, letting out a contented sigh. "It's amazing," she replied. "When I think back to that awful day in the store, I never could have imagined it would lead to all this." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the joyful scene before them. children played tag on the grass, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Families shared meals on picnic blankets, and groups of friends danced to the music drifting from the stage. "You know," Marcus said softly, "as hard as it was, I'm almost grateful for what happened. It opened our eyes to how much work still needed to be done." Melanie nodded, her eyes misting over. "And it showed us how strong we are together. I don't think I could have gotten through it without you, Marcus." He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "We got through it together, just like we've always done. And look at the result. A whole community coming together, supporting each other, fighting for what's right." They watched as Mr. Griffin, the store owner, approached a group of young people, engaging them in animated conversation. His face was alight with genuine interest and warmth. "Even those who hurt us have changed," Melanie observed. "It's not just about forgiveness, it's about growth and understanding." Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with pride and love. "We're blessed, Melanie. Blessed to have each other, and blessed to be part of this incredible community." As they sat there basking in the glow of what they had accomplished, both Marcus and Melanie felt a deep sense of gratitude. They had faced injustice head-on, and through their love for each other and the support of their community, they had turned a painful experience into a catalyst for positive change. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the community park, Marcus and Melanie Carter stood hand in hand on a small stage. Before them, a sea of faces looked up with admiration and respect. The couple had been invited to receive an award for their courage and commitment to justice, a testament to the impact they had made on their community. Marcus squeezed Melanie's hand, feeling a swell of emotion as he gazed out at the crowd. Among the faces, he spotted the police officers who had once treated Melanie so unfairly. Now they stood at the edges of the gathering, volunteering their time to patrol the event. Their presence was a powerful symbol of change and growth. As Melanie stepped forward to accept the award, she noticed Mr. Griffin, the store owner, standing near the front. He caught her eye and gave a small, apologetic smile. After the ceremony, he approached the couple, his hands fidgeting nervously. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I was wondering if you might consider allowing me to volunteer alongside you in your community outreach programs. I want to do more to make things right." Melanie's eyes softened as she saw the sincerity in Mr. Griffin's face. "Of course," she replied warmly. "We'd be glad to have you join us." As the evening progressed, Marcus and Melanie found themselves surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. They shared stories, laughed, and discussed plans for future initiatives. The atmosphere was one of hope and unity. Standing at the edge of the crowd, Marcus wrapped his arm around Melanie's waist. They looked out at the diverse group of people before them, young and old, from all walks of life, united in their desire for a more just and equitable world. "We've come so far," Melanie murmured, leaning into her husband's embrace. Marcus nodded, his eyes bright with determination. "And we have so much further to go, but we'll do it together, every step of the way." As they stood there, surrounded by the warmth and support of their community, Marcus and Melanie knew that their fight for equality was far from over. But they were ready to continue the journey, hand in hand, inspired by the changes they had already seen and the potential for even greater transformation in the future. If you enjoyed the story of Mr. and Mrs. Carter, Mr. Griffin and police officers, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.